And 8 mice were placed inside a perfect world, 4 males and 4 females, with unlimited food, unlimited water, and absolutely no threats, diseases, or predators of any kind. Yet 5 years later, every single one of them was dead, and not a single demise was caused by anything a veterinarian could have diagnosed. This was Universe 25, the most disturbing experiment ever run on a society. In 1968, an American ethologist named John Calhoun built this supposed paradise for mice inside a federal research lab in Maryland, filling every corner with soft nesting material, holding the temperature perfectly stable, and cleaning the cages by hand on a strict schedule. These were the healthiest specimens from the breeding colony of the National Institutes of Health. Calhoun had spent his entire career obsessed with one specific question: what happens to a society when nothing is hard anymore? And he had been chasing the answer for 2 decades, building 24 earlier versions of this paradise in a quarter-acre forest in Maryland, in barn enclosures, and in laboratory rooms, one after another. Each was a slightly different paradise for rats or mice with no scarcity, no predators, and no escape, and in every single one, he had seen the same pattern where the population would explode, violence would spike, mating would distort into something twisted and hyperactive, then collapse into apathy, and the colony would die. He had documented this pattern 24 times, and this 25th was meant to be the perfect, clean experiment, the final answer that nobody could argue with. He set it up inside a federal research lab in Maryland, a 9-foot square enclosure with apartments stacked along every wall, reached by mesh tunnels running floor to ceiling, which Calhoun called walk-up apartments. Each was fed by hoppers that never ran empty and water bottles that never ran dry. He calculated the space could comfortably support around 3,800 mice, but it would never come close to that number. On day 1, he placed his 8 founders inside and shut the lid. For the first 104 days, almost nothing happened as the mice explored, learned the geography, and worked out who slept where. Then, the first litters were born, and the population began to double every 55 days. And by day 315, more than 600 animals were living inside, climbing over each other on the ramp, sleeping in piles, and jostling for nesting space at the tops of the apartments. This was the moment everything began to come apart. In a normal mouse colony, when the population grows past what the territory can absorb, the surplus mice emigrate to find new ground. But inside Universe 25, there was no new ground. The young males, with nowhere to go and no role to fill, began drifting into the center of the enclosure, forming listless pools of bodies. Calhoun would stand by the pen for hours watching them do nothing. They had no fights to win, no females to court, and nothing to defend. They were healthy, well-fed, and had absolutely nothing to do. When one was attacked by another mouse, he would not fight back, but would lie there and absorb the damage, then stand up, walk a few feet, and lie down again. Yet, not every male went quiet. A second group formed at the same time on the opposite end of the spectrum, becoming frantic and indiscriminate. They moved through the enclosure faster than any other mice, forcing themselves into nests other males were trying to defend, skipping the courtship rituals every other mouse still followed, and refusing to be deterred even by violence from dominant males. In the worst pockets of the colony, behaviors began to appear that no functioning mouse society had ever produced. Some responded with their own retreat. Those who could not find a place in the social order climbed to the highest apartments and lived alone, stopping all interactions with males and refusing to reproduce. Calhoun also noticed a phenomenon he called the behavioral sink, where even though food was equally available everywhere, the mice began crowding compulsively around a few specific feeders. They would not eat alone, as the presence of other mice had become so deeply wired into their feeding instinct that a feeder without other mice, no matter how full, was useless to them, causing the crowding to get worse and worse around a handful of stations, while the rest of the enclosure sat almost untouched. Then, the mothers who were still trying to raise pups began to fail in a much darker way. Defending a nest in that environment took constant work, and the males who had originally claimed territory grew exhausted from patrolling and stopped protecting their families. This forced the mothers to defend the nests themselves while still nursing, and they turned on their own young, abandoning them in scattered places, forgetting which pups belonged to them, or failing to recognize them entirely. In the worst stretches, mothers began eating their own offspring, and in some sections of the colony, fewer than 1 in 20 newborn mice survived to weaning. Calhoun would write later that by that point, the social fabric of the colony was effectively dead. The bodies were still alive, but the structure that held them together as a species was not. The pups that did survive were raised by mothers who barely cared whether they lived, growing up with no model of what a functioning life inside this place looked like. When they grew up, they behaved like nothing Calhoun had ever seen. The males of this generation never fought, never tried to mate, and never engaged in any social activity at all. They ate, slept, and groomed themselves obsessively. Their fur stayed perfect because they never got into a single fight, moving through the colony as if no other mouse existed. Calhoun named them the beautiful ones. They looked externally like the healthiest mice in the entire colony, but they were also functionally dead. They never tried to reproduce, they could not socialize, and because their nervous systems had developed inside a world where every social role was already filled by someone else, they had simply opted out of the species. On day 560, the population peaked at 2,200 mice, and it would never go higher. The last successful conception inside Universe 25 happened on day 920, and after that, no new mice were born. The colony continued to age, the beautiful ones kept grooming themselves, the secluded females stayed in their high apartments, and violence carried on in pockets with no purpose left to it. And one by one, the mice died of old age, with no replacements coming up behind them, until on May 3rd, 1973, the last mouse in Universe 25 died, 4 years and 10 months after Calhoun shut the lid. He wrote that the mice had died 2 deaths. The first was the death of the spirit, and the second was the death of the body, with the first happening years before the second. When his paper came out, the world ran with the obvious reading that comfort kills, abundance kills, and a life with no struggle is a life that destroys itself. The image of the beautiful ones, perfect looking and quietly extinct, became one of the most cited metaphors of the late 20th century, pointed to by urbanists, religious leaders, and politicians on every side of every issue who wanted to warn about the decay of modern life. But that reading was not what Calhoun actually said. His real conclusion was sitting there in the paper in his own words, stating that for an animal as complex as a human being, a similar collapse was not just possible, but logical. If the number of individuals capable of filling meaningful roles greatly exceeds the number of roles available, only violence and disruption can follow. The killer was not comfort, but the disappearance of meaningful roles. When the population grew faster than the supply of meaningful roles the colony could offer, the mice with no place stopped functioning. The fighters had no one to fight, the mothers had nests that no one helped them keep, and the young grew up with nothing they were expected to inherit. The structure that gave each individual mouse a reason to participate in the species evaporated. The food never ran out, and the water never ran out, but what ran out was the friction that made being alive feel like something, a vital detail nobody had thought to put in the paradise to begin with. Calhoun himself was not a doomer. He spent the rest of his career not predicting collapse, but trying to prevent it, building new universes, changing the variables, and looking for the single thing he could put back into a paradise that would let it keep working. And he believed it could be done, and that humans could choose differently than the mice did. He wrote that as physical space contracts, the only way forward is to extend ourselves into conceptual space, into ideas, into networks, and into the work of building roles that did not exist before, a concept he called ideational generativity, which is simply a way to keep making new reasons to be here. But the experiment is still sitting there in the data, a perfectly designed paradise, 5 years, a complete extinction, and a cause of death no toxicology report would ever be able to name. And the mice did not have a choice, but we still do, and what happens next is on us.